a closeness with the heart within his own heart and him carrying it. So much so that whatever is done only by me is actually your doing, right? But then also the root of the root and the bud of the bud and the sky of this tree called life, which grows higher than a soul can hope or a mind can hide. This is the wonder that keeps the stars apart. And so there's a sense in which he recognizes that to love someone is to recognize that there is another. Where while fully understanding that there's a oneness. There's an interesting neurological study done about romantic relationships and breakups. That after an intense romantic relationship and there's a breakup, the individual goes through a period, like the body will undergo a period of withdrawal. There's a lack of dopamine, oxytocin, endorphin after a breakup. And the body literally goes through a physical withdrawal. Not quite as intense as if it was heroin or cocaine or something like that. But there is the chemical withdrawal. So this is, I think, what E.E. Cummings is trying to get at. This extreme intimacy, but also this ineffability that's hard for him to place. What you find in biblical poetry is that you might not have these exactly rhythmic readings in English, but in Hebrew, it's absolutely doing that. There's times where the Hebrew poets will start poems with the letter of an alphabet and then the next letter and the next letter. They're doing something formally as well. So here we are. We've read some poetry. We've gotten the juices going a little bit. So here we go. Where did we leave off last time again?
So we 23 we talk about
we barely started because
rhythm and repetition, lead word.
Okay.
And God saw it was good, and God saw it was good, and God saw it was good. Something like that.
Okay.
because we evaluated.
Yeah. One.
Yeah. So, we talked about variant words and how Hebrew works. We did the word codependent. Let's see where we leave. Oh yeah, we talked about lead words and groups of texts. We did Genesis 1, or no?
We did Genesis 1 a little bit.
Oh yeah. Okay, let's go back to Genesis 1 right now. So pull up Genesis 1. So we're going to try and continue to build the skill set of noticing repetition and letting repetition register. In Genesis 1, we talked about the introductory set of statements in verses 1 and verse 2, right? God created the heavens and the earth. And then, verse 2. And God said, let there be light, right? And so there's God's Spirit hovering in the dark, chaotic waters. And then we talked about the and. God saw that light was good. He separates. He calls the light darkness, and he calls blah, blah, blah. There was evening and morning one day, right? So the repetition we looked at was what? What is the repetition in the first section of Genesis?
And God said, and
Yeah.
it was good.
Yeah.
Light.
Good is being repeated, right? We talked about the distribution of good throughout the days, right? On the second day, there's actually no good, right? And on the third day, there's two good, right? And so we talked about how many scholars have observed that this purposeful splitting of the good on the days is trying to show you the making up for good on the third day, right? That's the pattern. The climax is day 6, right? And so what did we land on when we were talking about the distribution of the good? What is the clue that was given to us on why there's an uneven distribution throughout the days? What is God's definition of good?
God, what he saw.
Yeah, well, God, what he saw, but we did a little bit of interpretation Based on the distribution of good, or tov, in the first 6 days, what can we infer about God's definition of good? Because He created on the second day. He did something on the second day. What happened on the second day? On the second day. Yeah, on the second day there's just expanse, right? And there's no good there. Why?
Below and waters above. Expand the sky and there was evening. Expand the waters to separate water from water.
Yeah, and so we talked last week about the distribution of the word tov in the creation narrative tells us a little bit about what God sees as good, right? And the meaning of this, the distribution is giving us a clue into what good means for God. And good in Genesis 1 is about when we make concrete steps towards human flourishing on the land, right? And this is God's definition of good. On day 2, you don't make headway there. The waters just separate, right? You need day 3 to deliver the goods on what day 2 began. So the finishing, the finishing of the work on day 2 is on day 3, when the land appears. And then the food for those who would live on the land appears. That's been a prominent interpretation of this minutiae detail of the 2 goods on day 3. And that's a very compelling explanation, because good appears on days 4, 5, 6, and 7 after that. Day 2 is the only day without a pronouncement of good. And so we're already in the very just first section of Genesis, and we already have a very poignant usage of repetition, right? That little variation in a 7-day repetition signals a break in the pattern. And then you're invited to go have a cup of tea and take a long walk and think about it. And you're supposed to meditate on what this might mean, right? So how is good used in this chapter? Why was it repeated on these days and not this day, right? There you go. That's how you do it. That's how repetition works. That's a tiny detail that all of a sudden you're invited into pondering a very profound insight about what God deems as good. Human flourishing, right? He wants His creation to thrive, right? It's a profound insight into the chapter about God's definition of good just based on the distribution of the word tov. So notice that days 4 in verse 14, then God said, let there be. Look at the words. This is interesting. Then God said, let there be light. Does that ring a bell at all? What's verse 14 say? Let there be lights, right? So does that ring a bell? Okay, he's referring to something, that's for sure. He's referring to, we'll learn that there's stars, right? But why does that ring a bell? Let there be lights. Yeah, but differently, right? Light, right? Right, singular, right? It goes up to correspond with day 1. So day 4 corresponds with day 1. It actually works quite well in English. It's one of the rare instances where the repetition is repeated, right? In English and not obscured. So let there be light, let there be lights. So the word in Hebrew is this. Meor. Let there be Maor. Let there be Maor. It's putting the equivalent of M in front of the word. Right? Maor means lamp. That's the word you use for lamp. Like menorah. It's a derivative. It's a kind of a light, but it's a lamp. And this is the same word that appears for the lampstands in the temple. Why would the author of Genesis not use just the word for star? Why would he not just use the word for constellation? Why would the author of Genesis use the word lamp? Maor means light, or the lamp.
Means light, ma'u, right?
Yeah.
Verse 1.
Maor. No, so Maor is in verse 1 and verse 2. It's just,
Yeah,
yeah, in verse 14, I mean, right?
Verse 14 or something.
It's the same word. That's why light and lights. One is plural, one is not. But the word itself means lamp. So why would the author of Genesis not choose to use the word star or sun? Or why would he obscure the word sun?
So that it can cover different sources of light.
Okay, possibly. We're getting closer. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, this is a purposeful usage, right? We looked at other poems where they'll use a word that can really mean more than one thing, right? And so here, they're making a formal connection to, if we read the story of the Hebrew Bible, we'll get to the temple, and we'll see this again, right? The lamps, right? So all of a sudden, day 1 and day 4, even though they're distant from each other, they're linked by the same word, lamp. All of a sudden, just like Psalm 29, the beginning and ending of those poems, the beginning of this poem and day 4 of this poem are linked now, right? So day 1, God creates what? What happens in day 1?
Day 1?
Yeah.
Yeah, that is my observation. In day 1, there was light, and the purpose for that is to separate light and darkness.
Mm-hmm.
Right? In 14, the lights were created in the expanse of the sky to separate the day and night and the seasons, meaning and to mark the seasons and days and years.
Okay, this is good. So let's look at this. So day 1, what happens? What happens on day 1? So he said that light. How does the light come about?
Let there be light.
Okay, so there's just light. Is there a source?
Nothing. That's just let there be light.
Yeah, well, we can infer that the source is going to come from God, right? Yeah, so God is the one who says, let there be light, and then it separates the darkness from the light, right? By flooding the darkness with his divine light, right? You can think of this thing as the divine light of God separating. God says, let it be, and it is, and it separates, right? And so what ends up happening? Before, what was the image? Chaos, disorder, not suitable for life, right? In the darkness, the man can't live. And so what happens is God creates an ordered realm. Now there is a place for the light, and there is a place for the dark, right?
Evening and morning.
Yeah, and he calls it evening and morning. So there you have the night and there you have the day. They are just split, right? So what happens is God creates an ordered realm for the light, right? Day 4, what happens? God actually, yeah, go ahead.
Question. Yeah. So take a look at that, right? And it's kind of this is my first time looking at it. So he separated light and darkness, right? And then God called the light day and darkness called night. And there was evening and there was morning on the first day. But then on the 14th, right? Let there be lights in expanse to separate the day from the night. Was there a separation in the first day?
So yes, and so here what we have is an installation. It's an installation or a deputization of lights. Now there are a great light and lesser lights, right? He deputizes this creature, called light, right? The Maor, right? He deputizes these created things to do the separation that he did in day 1, right? So we have day 1, he's separating the light and the dark. In day 14, he creates creatures who will do the separating of the light for him, right? He lets the Maor do what he himself was doing in day 1, which is to separate between the light and the darkness. That's repetition, same but different, right? Day 5, which starts in verse 20. Then God said, let the waters teem with swarms of living creatures. Let the birds fly above the land in that rakia, against the face of the rakia up there, right? In the dome, right? In the dome. So the waters above, birds fly up in the realm of the waters above. Then you got creatures in the waters below. What day does that remind you of? Day 2. Yeah, that's day 2. That's what happens in day 2. The separation of the waters above from the waters below. And then you start to see that there's what? A pattern. There's a pattern that's happening in day 1, and day 4, and day 2, and day 5. And what is logical to conclude? That there's a pattern with day 3 and day 6, right? It's as if days 1 through 3 itemize the realms, right? It's almost as if days 1 through 3 are simply itemizing I forgot. So days 1, what happens in day 1? Light, dark, right? And day 2, waters, up and below. And then what happens in day 3? Land, right? Those are the 3 realms. What happens in day 4? So days 1 through 3 itemize the ordered realms of heaven. You have light and dark. You have the waters and the dry land, right? And then God is now systematically filling each of the realms with inhabitants in days 4 through 6, right? So who inhabits the space of light and dark now? The lights, the Maor, right? The Maor inhabit that. What inhabits the skies and or the dome and the waters below? Creatures, birds and the great sea monsters, right? Yeah, right? And then day 3 begins in verse 24, let the land bring out. So what happens? Does he create? In day 3.
In day 3, just the dry ground.
Yeah?
And then God said the land to produce, commanded it to produce vegetation.
Okay? Commanded it to produce. That's very different from how we typically, God created it. No, he commands it to produce, right? He's summoning the creative potential of the land to therefore produce, right? He summons, and then when you get, hey land, bring forth creatures, right? And it was so. And it was good that it did it, right? And so you can just imagine the scene. It's not typically how we think of it, is that God says it and then out of his mouth comes these things. God is commanding, he's beckoning it to come forth. You can almost imagine come out Lazarus, right? There's a beckoning from the land, right? And so he's summoning the earth to generate life. Just like it generated plants on day 3, now on day 6, what is happening? It's generating creatures. What kinds of creatures are happening on day 6? What are being summoned on day 6?
Let the land with living creatures, animals probably according to their land, right?
Yes.
Wild animals.
Yeah. So you have the word behemoth, behemoth, right? So the word for the animals or creatures here is behemoth, which is behemoth. Okay? So you have the beasts of the earth, and then in verse 26, the humans. It's just repetition. Then all of a sudden, the 6 days of Genesis all line up in corresponding patterns. Then if you think about it in your mind, what you just created with the 6 days was this little cross relationship between the 6 days, right? They're related. It's not just a linear flow, it actually cross relates. So notice what this has to do with the realm of the heavens. What this has to do with what's between the waters and the waters above and the waters below, what this has to do with the dry land. And then day 7 comes along, as it were, as a capstone, as a climactic capstone to the whole thing. And all you're doing is observing repetitions and where they're repeating, right? Genesis 1 simply drops it in front of you in a linear form, but it's up to you to notice repetition, to make the cross relations, right? You want to see something else that's interesting? Remember Genesis 1:1? It's a little header for the chapter, right? Right? People actually debate this thing that we're going to talk about. So this is a rabbit hole that we're going to try and avoid. We're just going to try and keep it simple here. There are 7 Hebrew words in Genesis 1:1. Genesis 1:2 names the pre-creation state. There are 7 times 2 words in Genesis 1:2. 7 words. That's a sentence of 7 times 2 words. Issues in a narrative about 7 days. And the narrative about the 7 days consists of 3 sentences of 7 words and a little concluder to end it all. It's as if this thing is designed just like Psalm 29 as an expansion of Genesis 1 is 7 words. Genesis 1:2, 14 words. And then Genesis, going on to the end of the capstone, is 21 words. Right? So you've got a beginning and an ender and an internal growing scheme of words based on 7. And then internally you have all of these corresponding literary units that all work in a sequence. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. 1 and 4 and 2 and 5 and 3 and 6. But then the repetition also creates a symmetry. In this case, it's a forward symmetry. A, B, C, A, B, C. Then what was the 3 with 7? Right? The concluding lines of the 7th day. The 7th day consists of 3 sentences that have 7 words each. And then a little concluding cap formula. So verse 1, 7 words. Verse 2, 2 times 7 words. The 7th day, 3 times 7 words. And you're meant to see all of those as one. Right? The 7th day where it was all done and it wraps around. And then internally you've got 2 triads, ABC, ABC. Right? So, right, like actually the challenge of Genesis 1 is that it's an absolutely complex form of visual poetry, right? That works on repetition on many levels. And so the action in comparing them and noticing the similarity, that's the real task of reading Genesis. Is Genesis 1 poetry? Well, it's very clearly narrative, right? It's in narrative form. And this happened, but it has the basic design principles of poems as its fundamental structure, right? It's the same as Psalm 29 that we looked at, or Psalm 67, right? Hebrew Bible is doing this all over the place. Just dense repetitions and structural changes. Every page is like this. You cannot read one page of the Hebrew Bible where they're not doing this. If we could just zoom into days 4 through 6, I could point out all of these other things that's going on the sentence level, going on with just 4 through 6. Right? We can make a whole new little chart, just days 4 through 6, and look at the complexity of it. We could make a whole chart of just day 5 and how it works. And we're back to the quilt analogy. These things have been woven together, right? Let me just do one more thing for you guys. Look at days 4, 5, and 6, right? So look at days 4, 5, and 6. Let's try and notice some things about the inhabitants. Okay? Are there commands maybe? Let's see what we can find, what we can notice in the Genesis creation narrative of days 4, 5, and 6.
Commands?
Or let's just read. Let's just try and see what we can find. So
there are obvious commands. Let there be.
Yeah.
Let them serve. Let them be lights.
So let's look at let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, the livestock, the creatures that move along the ground, and the behemoth, each according to its kind, and it was so. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds, and God saw that it was good. Okay, nice. Let's look at the corresponding day in the earlier, right? Verse 11, actually. Yeah. Let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants, and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds, and it was so. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening, and there was morning the 3rd day. Right? So this is all happening on what happens on day 3? What's created on day 3?
Day 3, yeah, those are the ones on the third day, day 3. Those ones, the land produced vegetation. That is day 3.
Okay, so this is interesting. So 2 things are created on day 3, right? 2 things are beckoned out of the earth. 1, vegetation, right? Plants bearing seed according to their kinds, and then trees bearing fruit with seed according to their kinds, right? Now let's go to day 6. What was created on day 6?
Day 6.
Well, there's the living creatures according to their kinds, right? So the livestock, the creatures on the ground, and the wild animals, right? And it was so. And then God made wild animals, and then God made man in our likeness so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and the wild animals, and all over the creatures that move along the ground, right? And then God blessed them and said,
I give you every.
well,
Fill the earth,
be fruitful. So there's a repetition. Where does fruitful, where do we see that word earlier?
It's in verse 20. Yeah. Verse 20. Verse 22.
Uh-huh.
God blessed them and said, these are the living creatures, the birds and the fish.
Uh-huh.
He said, be fruitful and increase in number, and fill the waters in the sea, and let the birds increase on the earth.
Uh-huh.
There was evening and there was morning.
But we also see it earlier
Yeah.
in day 3.
Day 3. Yeah, be fruitful there.
Not be fruitful, a variation.
Produce.
Yeah, the trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, right? And so what we have is, on analogy, the day 3 and day 6 as corresponding. The first thing created on day 3 is vegetation, seed-bearing plants, right? And grass, things like that. And then on day 6, the first thing created is the livestock, the creatures that move along the ground, and the wild animals, who will then eat the plants on the ground, right? Who can eat the fruit? Who can eat the tree? Yeah. So
Give you the seed bearing, blah,
yeah,
blah, blah.
yeah, I give you the seed bearing. So yes, so this is interesting, right? Then God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it, they will be yours for food. And then what happens for the beasts?
The beast will also, yeah, and all the beasts of the earth.
Just green plants for food, right? So there's a separation of what's being fed to the man and what's being fed to the creatures, right? The fruit with seed is for the man, right? That's their actually creation partner on day 3, right? Man is like tree, right? Which is something we see all throughout Scripture, right? And actually when images of God behave like beasts, we have a story in the Bible that actually shows us what they eat. King Nebuchadnezzar, what does he eat? Grass, right? But then that's because he's behaving like a beast, right? So there's all these little poetic asides that are really helpful, right? So let's look at this little unit, right? So when we're looking at a photo mosaic, what are you looking at? What determines what you're looking at when you're looking at a photo mosaic? What changes what you're looking at in a photo mosaic? Huh?
Yeah, in the photo mosaic.
In a photo mosaic, what determines what you look at? Colors? But on a more literal sense, what's determining, like, how do you know what you're looking at? Are you looking at the photo mosaic of Louis Armstrong, or what? Are you looking at each individual thing? Yeah. So what influences what you're actually looking at? How close you look, right? If you zoom out, you see Louis Armstrong. If you zoom in, you'll see Louis Armstrong with a trumpet, with his friend, with a cornet, right? So it really depends on how close you get, right? So how close in are you? If you look at the photo mosaic of Louis Armstrong, you can say, whoa, this is Louis. But then when you look close, you can say, oh, that's John Coltrane. It's all about scope and zoom, right? And different words will highlight different levels of relationship within the text depending on your zoom and where you're looking, right? So thoughts or questions about the example, because we can focus in on trees in day 3 and 6, or you can look at the grand scheme, right? Any questions about scope and zoom and repetition at this level?
You have to pay attention and read it carefully.
Yeah, quite. And so when you're thinking about poetry versus narrative, when you're trying to figure out just how much of the Bible is poetry and just how much of the Bible is narrative and how much of it is other stuff, I think that's the wrong question, right? Hebrew, by necessity or by design, is a poetic language. The entire language is image-based. Do you know how to say life in Hebrew? Or in your English Bible, the word that usually gets translated from the Hebrew word for this is soul. Soul. No, that's actually spirit.
But breath.
No, yeah, so this is interesting. So soul and spirit in our English might refer to the same things, but in the Hebrew Bible, there's quite a different word. And so the Hebrew word for soul is literally throat.
Yeah.
Or nefesh. So that's the Hebrew word nefesh. Oh, sorry, there's actually an H there, right? But that's the Hebrew word for soul. It means throat. Okay, that's interesting. That's an image, right? That's actually an image. That's not a Hebrew. That's not a literal thing. Is my soul literally my throat? No, but it means that. Why? If soul means something like life, why is throat? Why would the Hebrew language use this word? Why would that be used to mean life? Exactly. It's where air passes. If you don't have a throat, so if you're trying to figure out if somebody's dead, how do you figure that out? Yeah, you check the pulse, or you check if they're breathing through their mouth. So early Hebrew people, even if they don't have an idea of what a lung is or things like that, or what it does or how it functions, they knew that if you cut this is it, it's over for that person, right? They also knew that if you chain this, they can't get away. They also knew that if you drown, you're fine if everything else is underwater, but your throat must stay above. Right? And so there's this sense that Hebrew as a language is poetic at its base, right? And so when we're talking about how to read Hebrew Bible, we cannot simply just say, what does this word mean? Right? Because the words only mean what they mean in the context of everything else, right? So remember our basic description of Hebrew poetry. Right? So this is what Hebrew poetry, this is my basic definition of Hebrew poetry. It is short, dense lines of 3 to 5 words, appearing in rhythms, usually in patterns of 2 or 3. Right? That's usually what Hebrew poetry is. It's usually couplets or pairs of couplets, usually 3 to 5 words, and short. Right? And narrative has a different form. What's the form of narrative? What's the narrative form? You don't overthink this. The narrative form is, and then he said this, and then immediately after he did this, afterwards this, soon after this, right? It's a structured forward moving. So even though it's written in that structure, even though it looks poetic or sounds poetic, is it poetry if this is the form? If it goes, and then this, and then this, and then this. We just observed Genesis 1, which is clearly a narrative. Is it poetry or is it narrative? It still is a narrative, but in order to understand its in order to understand its intent, we resorted to a lot of poetry. And so what in the field of not just biblical studies, but in literature together, we've found that we need better vocab. We need better vocabulary to talk about this kind of writing. And so the word that we've found is this. Narrative poetics, right? Genesis 1 is not poetry. It's narrative, but it's also not poetry, right? It's this happened, he said this. It has the same structure as every other narrative in the Hebrew Bible, but it's poetic in its design. So a narrative can have a poetic design just as much as a narrative design. Poetry can have a poetic design, but it can also have a narrative design, right? And it's the poetic design that we're seeing that's similar, even though quote-unquote literary type is different, right? But we need better vocabulary because they're not split categories. Do you see what we're saying? Right? We're thinking more along the lines of how we're thinking about a complex structure. So the Hebrew Bible is a complex structure. It exists in some poetry, it exists in some narrative, but the overlap between the two is immense. And so think about the way that God speaks, the way that God is written to speak in the Bible, oftentimes is poetry. The very beginning of Joshua, he says, "Be of good courage," right? It's written like a poem, like the blessing of God is written like a poem, but we wouldn't call it poetry. We would call it maybe discourse because God is saying it, right? And so you see how the categories break. I remember when I was taking a wisdom literature and poetry class in undergrad, this was one thing that I could never truly understand, why wisdom literature was not simply just poetry, and why poetry was not wisdom literature, and why did you think to teach them in the same class, right? There was obviously a connection that they made between the two, but they set them as separate categories, but the categories were never 100% split, right? There was so much overlap between Song of Songs and all those things. And so that's when narrative poetics, which is a developing field of study, became very interesting to me, right? Speeches in the Bible often work like this. It's a narrative, and then within the narrative is a speech, and within the speech is a poem, and within the poem is a quote, right? And sometimes there's wordy speeches where we're thinking just get to the point, and then sometimes you get like Nineveh, which is just 5 words, right? 9 times out of 10, the repetition is actually inviting you to do something with it, right? First, to memorize it, right? Repetition helps for memorizing, right? But then what really helps when you're doing this is to take a sheet of paper, like print out a Bible verse, or write it yourself, and then highlight all of the repeated words in a specific color. We did this in Ephesians, remember, when we talked about inheritance, when we talked about election, when we talked, right? We highlighted all of those things. Unity, one in Christ. We highlighted all of these things, right? Because this is what we need to do to get our minds around this thing. We need to highlight these things, or we need to be able to visualize it, right? And so here's where we'll end. We're going to just briefly begin section 24. But I have a question first before we begin this thing. What's something that stands out to you about how repetition or structure works in Genesis 1? This is just a personal thing. What's something that stands out to you with regards to repetition? Okay, This is one for me. I think this is really interesting because repetition clues us into just as much about the meaning and intent of the author, but it also clues us into theological presuppositions or theological propositions. What's a supposition? That's a presupposition. What's a What's a supposition? It's really just an uncertain belief. I'm supposing this, and it's like a working definition, right? We have a supposition. And so here we go with, it clues us into the author's suppositions or presuppositions, right? About theology, about how God works, about what mankind is, right? And then it also clues us into just theological frameworks that they're absolutely drawing from that we might not have the full scope of. So for one, here's a repetition that really is interesting to me. Look at verses 14 through, just look at day 4 and 6. Okay, look at day 4 and 6. Just think about any verbs that can be seen as repetitions. Even remember that some words in Hebrew are similar roots, even though, and they will have the same 3 consonants, but we can't see that in English, right? We can't see the same 3 consonants in English, but you could be able to see maybe synonyms. Let's look at day 4 and 6 and see if we can find a synonym. Okay.
God made and God set.
Okay, God made and God set. So let's. I'm trying to draw a relationship between 4 and 6.
Yeah, God said. To start with, verse. Are you referring to day 6 and day 4, right?
Yeah, day 6 and day 4. I want to look at a verb that could be seen as a synonym, because if there's a synonym, then it's a purposeful repetition. Let's just start at 6. Let's start at 6. So let's look at all the verbs. God said. Okay, we know that one. Let. Produce.
Made.
Yeah, move.
Saw.
Uh-huh.
Move. Saw. Again. Make.
Okay, so these are all standard repetitions, but let's look for a verb that we don't see, that stands out. Verse 26.
Move.
Well, we've seen move. Day 6, 26. Rule. Okay, there's a word, rule. Who rules?
Man, in this one is man.
Yeah, but typically who rules? What kind of word is rule?
Authority.
Okay, but specific, right? The word rule, like if I'm a,
A person in power or in position.
yeah, typically, but so like a person in power, the president does not rule. We'll say he governs. But who rules?
So monarchy.
A monarch. Okay, a monarch. So now let's see. That's a very interesting standout verb. Everything else is repeated quite a bit, but this one is unique. Let's go to day 4. Is there a synonym? Govern. Okay, so there's a repetition there. And so this is quite an interesting repetition. So there are only 2 characters that govern on behalf of God in Genesis 1. We usually only notice one of them. And who's the one we usually notice? Man. But there's another set of characters who also govern. And where do they live? Not in the waters above, not in the waters below,
The sky.
but there.
There.
Right? Wherever,
Span,
yeah,
whatever you call it.
yeah, where, somewhere there, right? So there's the three levels, right? So I'm going to draw it, right? So
Great lights. They're called the great
so we have land, right? So you see this? I'm going to draw a picture of land. We got land here. And then we have the waters, right? And then we have the dome. And then who's in the dome? Who flies in the dome, in the expanse of the dome? Birds, right? Who lives on the land? Man. And I'm going to draw a cow. Okay? And then fish. Or the great sea monsters, or however you want to say it. The Leviathan, right? Where are the greater and lesser lights who govern? How do we know that how do we know that these are the realms? Because day 1, 2, 3 showed us, right? So what is the realm of day 3? The land, right? Because trees and flowers grow there. Right, these are whatever. It's ugly. But and then how do we know what's the realm of day 2? It's the water above and the water below, right? So the expanse and the waters below. What's the realm of day 1?
It's just
Yeah, it's actually quite vague, right? But we know that God was the source of light in day 1, right? So this is a divine space where the light is, right? And then it falls on the other two realms. So what is the realm of the greater and lesser lights? Who?
it's called the expanse of the sky.
Yeah,
Where they realize at the expanse of the sky.
yeah.
That's what it says. Separate day.
Yeah, remember, but the word there is not actually expanse. The word there is rakia, and rakia is a dome, right? So these are in the dome of the sky. So here maybe, right? Something like that. But they govern. Why? What are they?
So they are the lesser light, the greater light, and then stars.
And the lesser light governs the night, and the greater light governs the day. But he also made stars. And he set them in the vault of the sky in order for what? To give light on the earth, to govern the day, and to separate light from the darkness. This is a very interesting repetition that's not, we can easily brush past this and not read it at all, right? Oh, they're just giving light, cool. But actually, it's a fairly load-bearing statement for the rest of the Bible, right?
Verse 2, it's a repetition of verse 2.
It's a bit you could say that whatever God was doing in day 1, these created lights and the stars were what? They were given also an authority to do what? To separate light from darkness, what God did, to govern the day and the night, what God did, and to give light on earth, what God did, right? They're providing for whom? Those who would be made in the image, right? Right? So it's good because they're here for human flourishing. What's the purpose? It says to let them serve as signs to mark sacred times, right? Seasons and years, right? So this is a very interesting statement. So we can get into this in future lessons, but question mark, who are these creatures? Do they appear again? What do they do? Right? They do appear again quite a bit. Once you actually read this, it's very hard to unsee these creatures who are given, it seems like we meet one of them in Genesis 3, right? Who seems to know the business of God. Oh, God didn't say that, I know, right? Things like that.
They appear again
Yeah.
in Joseph's dream.
Yeah, in Joseph's dream, exactly. And they also bow and they serve, and so it's quite interesting. So that's what stands out to me in terms of repetition.
determine what's good. And then it's very, very subtle in the fall. Finally, then determine what's good.
Yeah, that's the slight thing. And so the repetition is the seeing.
Seeing, yeah.
The seeing, right?
God's soul. So my question to you is this one. All this time, how do they see the tree of the fruit of good and knowledge and evil? Because I know God created it good, but He only said that don't eat.
Yeah, so it wasn't not good.
Yeah.
The thing that was not good was eating it for food, right? And so you have a sense in that this story operates at quite an interesting level, right? When we're talking about the sin of the garden is not as simple or as straightforward as we were like to believe when we were younger. The sin of the garden is quite involved. It actually involves a question of how are these image of God, these image bearers of God, how are they to rule and be fruitful and multiply with wisdom, right? How are they to do that wisely? We're given a little insight into that, where it might have been good for them to show up and walk with God that day, right? So this is something that, I won't start the next lesson, but I think this is worth saying. This is something that I was talking with a few friends maybe 4 years ago. This is the garden, yes? Dead. This is the garden. It's all dead. This is the garden, okay? Yeah, I know, I'm going to throw these. So this is the garden. Where was the tree of knowledge of good and evil? In the middle. I'm just going to draw. It's an umbrella. Whatever, it's an umbrella. Okay, so there's a tree in the center of the garden. Where's the tree of life? Read it. Read it. Where's the tree of life? Read it. See if you can find it. This is an interesting question for me. So I started to read Genesis this way. I started to read the Genesis this way because of where's the tree of life? See if you can find it. We actually don't see it in Genesis 1. We see it in Genesis 2. Okay, so where is the tree of life? Where is it planted? The tree of life, look at Genesis 2. Read Genesis 2. This is the one, see, this is how we know we don't really know our origin stories, right? We talk about how Genesis 1 is such a basic story, but where's the tree of life? Yeah, they're both at the center. So there's two trees. So there's two trees at the center of the garden. What day did Eve eat of the fruit? We don't know. It could have been any day. It was just a day. How long between she was created and the event at the Garden of Eden? We don't know. It's ambiguous and vague. So how long were they in the garden? How many days did they not eat of the fruit? We don't know. There's no information about how long it took for them to eat of the fruit. We're reading the day that she eats the fruit. Okay? Genesis 3. So, and the prohibition. But so, she's eating of the, we read in Genesis 3 of the day that she eats the fruit. Okay? Supposing she met with the snake, the serpent, and she met with this serpent, and she said, no, I won't eat of the fruit. Suppose, is the problem solved?
I think so. Or probably it will be repeated again until they fall. We don't know.
We don't. so this is something that I learned from reading midrash. So rabbis, when they when they do a midrash, it's essentially the passage of scripture, and then they just write a bunch of questions, and then they keep leading. The questions lead to a point, right? There's so much we don't know about Adam and Eve. How old were they?
By this time, yeah, we don't know.
We don't know. Were they born with belly buttons or no belly buttons? We don't actually know, right? We don't know a lot of things. And so there's a lot of... We picture that they're adults, right? That's in our head. But does the text make us think that they're adults? No, all we know is that they were created and it was not good for them to be alone, right? At what age does Eve meet the serpent? We don't know. And so, will an adult know? Would an adult know what to do in this situation? Maybe. Not any more than a child. What matters, what do you need to make a good decision at this tree?
Yeah, that is also that has been my question.
Yeah.
For all of this time, I've been thinking, because there is no time frame, for all of this time, because we know that Adam died around, how many years did Adam die? About 600 or 700 years old, right? We know that they've been there living, and there's no problem. Probably they just didn't enjoy the fruit, or we don't even know, it was not mentioned if they partook of the tree of life.
Yes. And so here, this is where you get in. Yeah.
By the way, the Seventh-day Adventists believe that they partook of it, that's why they live a long life. And that's why it has to be guarded, because if it's not guarded, then they will for living in eternity. Because they get that from Revelation, because we will be eating of the tree of life every
Yes.
day. You know, right?
Yeah, sure. And so, but this is the point. This is the point. There's so much that's actually ambiguous about the Adam and Eve story. One, their names are not Adam and Eve until after the fall, right? Adam gets a name, but Eve doesn't. Eve is just the woman until the fall, right? So you have these two characters, a man and a woman, right? Or male and female is actually the word. And Ish and Isha, they're at the center of the garden, next to the tree of life. Apparently Adam is here. They made a poor choice at the tree. What did they need to make a good choice at the tree? But what would remembering what God said, right? They would have needed to remember the word of the Lord, which apparently Eve was not there to hear. So Adam should have remembered. Why didn't Adam remember?
He goes with the conversation.
Maybe
Or
there's
he
a
was not interested.
yeah. There's a lot of room to wonder why it went down that way, because the text lets you have that room, right? There's a rabbi who claims that Adam and Eve were actually children and they needed to grow up. They needed wisdom. They needed to spend multiple days walking with the Lord, right? They needed to grow, and he makes this leap that Adam and Eve are moral children, because every time they talk about good and knowing between good and evil, they talk about where I'm like a child. Children don't know their left from their right, right? That's what Solomon says, right? Give me wisdom because I'm like a child. I don't know my left from my right, right? And so that's an Adam and Eve phrase. And so the rabbi then says they were spiritually immature. They were morally immature. They didn't have wisdom, right? The problem of the garden is that if Eve said no on that day, what is still in the center of the garden? It's still the same tree, right? That what needed to be done is they need wisdom to know that that is no good and that this is good. And unless you can have reliable wisdom, growth and development in wisdom. Yeah.
And the thing that I was driving at,
Yeah.
the thing that I was driving at is this one. Oh, there are different fruit, so they should be bearing different fruit, right? They cannot be both mangoes or orange, right? One is an apple probably, or one is a mango. So that's not no bear. But the point that I was driving at is that they determine that fruit
Yes. And so, yes, exactly. So that's the point. So up until this point, God had been deciding what was tov, good, and what was ra, bad. Right? For example, he declared to his creation to be good in Genesis 1:10, 1:12, 1:18, and on and on. And Adam without Eve, he also declared to not be good, right? It was not good for human flourishing that Adam had no one else, right? Genesis 2:18, will humans continue to live with God, allowing him to see and define what is good for them and teach them and show them what is good and what is bad? Or will they take the fruit before it's time and use the power to define good and bad for themselves outside of God's wisdom? Unfortunately, that's what they do, right? But the problem of the garden was not a one-time choice. If Eve had proven resilient on that day, the tree is still at the center of the garden, right? And so that's the moral story. Every time in Scripture, a major patriarch or a major character makes a decision, it's at a tree. What will you do with Adam? What will you do with your nephew Lot? Where are they? Oaks of Mamre, right? So the story then tracks decisions of wisdom and not wisdom by trees. That's a repetition that I think will have lots of payoff as we continue to read. So homework for next week is look for a story with a tree in it. Look for a story with a tree in it and see what you find, right?
The story of Joseph.
Yeah, there's a tree in a dream. So do that, because what we get is essentially the major plot conflict is that the image bearer of God has difficulty making a wise choice at a tree. And it's a tree of a test. Where does Jesus make his final test? In an olive grove, right? Then the fig tree. And so Jesus makes his final test. Jesus becomes an archetype, a fulfillment of the archetype. He's by the tree and he does, not my will, but yours, right? That's a picture of Adam in a garden, making the good choice for once, right? And so this is an opportunity to find other stories. So I'm going to close this in prayer and then we can head out. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time and for this evening where we get to continue to study your scriptures and your word and to hopefully see what you have for us more clearly. Lord, be with us as we go throughout our week and as we continue our readings on our own and within our community. In your name we pray, amen. Evan, can you put the... Oh, I'll do it.